Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us on our Stantec webinar series, Living with Water, the Blue-Green Corridors Project in New Orleans. My name is Ryan Bernadette. I'm the Marketing Director for Stantec's Water Group in North America. I'll be your moderator. I'm going to start off with a few housekeeping items. First, you'll be muted during the presentation, but you can use the questions option in GoToWebinar to add any comments or questions, and I will get to those at the end. I will also give you the ability to unmute yourself with roughly 5 or 10 minutes left in the presentation if you'd like to comment or ask your question live for any kind of direct discussion. And finally, I will follow up with a certificate of attendance for everyone so that you can submit that to your local professional development board, registration board for some PDH credit. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Dan Grandal and he will kick off our presentation.
How you doing? My name is Dan Grandal, and today we're going to talk about Living with Water, Blue-Green Corridors project. And this is a project all about resilience, flood risk reduction, subsidence, reducing subsidence in New Orleans, and also improving the quality of life. So we're going to go through that a little bit. If you go back to the introduction, I'm in the New Orleans office, and I'm a flood protection engineer by training, and kind of flood risk mitigation projects just like this one are kind of what I've done my whole career. Also, Bernadette Callahan, she's out of our Philadelphia office, and she's our lead for our water group for green infrastructure and has done many projects of green infrastructure across the country. So we're going to guide you through the project. If you go to the agenda here, we're going to start with the safety moment. Safety is very important at Stantec, and we want to make sure that we focus in on it right at the beginning of any meeting. It'll be kind of focused on an aspect of the project as well. And then we're going to go to kind of the background and challenges, and I'm going to guide you through the kind of the story behind the project so that you get an idea of why the project exists and what some of the challenges are. And then we'll talk a little bit about where New Orleans has come from for building resilience and what this project kind of provides additionally that is different. And it's really that living with the water approach that kind of reintroduces water back into the city. And it's a different way of thinking about drainage and protecting the city. So it's a new way that the city has kind of focused itself. And then Bernadette's going to really kind of go into the Blue-Green Corridors project and talk through what it entails, what the design process has been, and what the benefits of the project are. So that's our agenda. And like I said, if you have any questions at the end, we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. All right, so starting out with our safety moment, there are complete street aspects to this project where we are putting bike lanes throughout the neighborhood. So if you're going to be bike riding in the neighborhood, wear a helmet, be seen, wear something that you know is going to stand out, and bright colors work. You know, if you're biking at night, no black shirts, things like that. Know the weather forecast. Don't be caught out in the rain and then all of a sudden be hurrying up. That can cause accidents. Install rear view mirrors on your bikes. That's going to help you to see what somebody that you might not see. Be alert. Ride with a buddy. That's pretty important. You don't want to be out there alone if you can avoid it. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but that also helps with being seen. Get creative with your route. Sometimes it's better to stay off of like heavily trafficked routes. And the city of New Orleans is doing a lot to create additional routes and additional bike lanes throughout the city. And then carry a patch kit in case something does happen. You have a first aid or something. A patch kit also for your tires and in case you do get a flat. So, all right, let's get started with the presentation. First, I'm going to go through some background of the drainage in New Orleans and some challenges that the city faces. Okay, and there's New Orleans on the map. You can see it in the red circle. It's surrounded by water with the Gulf of Mexico on one side, Lake Pontchartrain on the other, and then the Mississippi River that kind of snakes through the city as well. And the city was founded on deltaic soils, which means like really soft marsh swampland, right? And so we've dried up some of those swamps to create the city. And that you know, being with all these three waterfronts really causes some challenges for the city. And over the years, you know, it's been the Mississippi River or hurricanes that have really posed a lot of challenge to the city and flooding events and disasters. You go to the next slide. Just to give you an idea of the terrain, on one side is the Mississippi, you see Lake Pontchartrain on the other side, and basically New Orleans is in a big bowl. It's below sea level. At times, you know, it's 10 to 15 feet below sea level. You can see there where the blue-green corridors of the Gentilly Resilience District lies, and it's at one of the lowest parts of the city. And then the whole city is protected by these flood walls and levees along the Mississippi River and along the Lake Pontchartrain, which over the years, as disasters have happened, and when a disaster happens, you get a Mississippi River flood or a hurricane that surges the lake, it'll obviously fill the bowl. And so when we have breakages, those disasters have happened, and what has happened is we've built higher and gotten the system to kind of go more resilient as these things have happened. If you go to the next slide there. So over the years in the 20th century, there was a drainage system that was built. It was pumps were built, levees, canals, and it allowed to kind of develop some land that wasn't developable before and control some of that flooding that at the time in the early years was uncontrolled. And it was giant pumps. You can see the picture there. Some of these pumps are still in operation today, but New Orleans became the model for other areas about how to handle stormwater and how to, you know, control these really large flood events. And it, like I said, it allowed us to develop some of these areas like Gentilly, which was really a swamp. And it's one of the largest pumping systems in the world, over 50,000 CFS, the entire system. And it was strengthened over time. But even with all this pumping capacity and these giant pumps, the system can still be overwhelmed because New Orleans is in an area that you get really strong rain events. You know, we get over 55 inches of rain per year, and we get some really intense storm events. You go to the next slide, Bernadette. As New Orleans was developed, right, the pumps, though they're really powerful and can evacuate a lot of water over time, some of these really intense storms really overwhelm the system, and those systems can cause a lot of flooding and a lot of damage within the neighborhoods. And what you're seeing here is a hydrograph of what the pump station sees. And you know, before everything was developed and you built roads and houses and put impervious areas, you know, that blue line kind of represents what the pumps would have normally seen. As things got developed and there was less places for water to go, you can see how the peak goes up. And part of the philosophy behind this project and green infrastructure in general is to try to get back to that natural kind of hydrograph to reduce the peak and reduce flooding by spreading out kind of where the rain events happen, and what the pump sees in the end. And one other thing that really is over time has really been a stressor to New Orleans is sea level rise, and then more intense storm events. We've gotten really intense storm events, especially lately in the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, there was a storm event that gave us about 8 inches in 2 hours in a big part of the city that caused a lot of damage and a lot of flooding. And that was only a couple of years ago. So we've been seeing these 100-year, 500-year storms, which you wouldn't expect to see very often, a lot more frequently. If you go to the next slide. Now, in 2005, everything changed with Katrina. There was over 1,833 deaths of people that lost their lives. And it's interesting because, you know, the evacuation was actually really successful. And it was like 99% of the people were evacuated. But the people that were left behind, you know, there was nowhere to go. And in some cases, there was about 15 feet of flooding in their neighborhoods. And they just couldn't get up high enough in their houses. There was 50 levee breaches, about $81 billion in property damages that resulted from the storm. You can see right there on 17th Street, that was one of the big levee breaks right there. The levee basically fell apart, and all the water from the Lake Pontchartrain just poured right into the bowl and filled it up right up to the sea level. Approximately 80% of the city was flooded, and the pumping system was basically useless because, you know, it was all flooded, and all the electrical systems were flooded, and you know, the operators weren't able to kind of operate the system. So if you go to the next slide, Bernadette, you know, this isn't a historical thing that we see this threat from hurricanes. You know, this is this hurricane season, and we've been in the cone of influence 8 times. We got hit a couple of times, and this last one caused a lot of power damage and trees that fell and branches and stuff. Luckily, we didn't get hit with a major catastrophic, but our residents always live with this kind of fear of when the next storm is coming, and we know at one point one of these big storms are coming. So we always got to build things with resilience in mind. If you go to the next slide, I think in some of the physical stressors that we have, you can see around the city, that red line that you see there is pretty much the city of New Orleans, and the hurricane risk reduction system, which is a combination of levees, flood walls, and pump stations. And you know, there's some gates and stuff that close up, and then all the rain that falls within the system needs to be pumped up and over the levees. And some of the stressors that we have are sea level rise, coastal flooding and erosion. There's some marshland south of New Orleans, which historically have protected New Orleans from hurricane surges. That has been eaten away over time. There's urban flooding as these more frequent storms have happened. And as I mentioned, loss of power. We spent a week and a half without power last month based on a hurricane that came through here, pretty much the entire city. Go to the next slide. Another challenge that we have are the subsidence and the sinking delta soils. Kind of what we've always tried to do here in New Orleans is pump the water out as fast as possible, right? Get it out so it doesn't cause flood damages. And what it's caused is those marsh soils, those organic soils, to dry up. And as they dry up, they cause subsidence. And you can see it in our roads, in our houses, even sidewalks that settle. So, you know, that's a big issue that we have to deal with. And this project tries to find solutions for that as well. Another challenge is the social stressors. A lot of these areas that are low-lying are low and middle income areas, and they're kind of hit harder by some of these flooding events, because some of the upper areas, the French Quarter and things like that were built first were built on the high areas. These other neighborhoods that were built after are some of our lower income, as you can see by the graph there. There's our project area in red, but there is some sort of social inequity in how they see this flood risk and the damages that we see on a yearly basis here in New Orleans. If you go to the next slide, talk a little bit about building resilience. So when Katrina hit, the Army Corps of Engineers, the federal government put in $14.6 billion. The state and New Orleans also put in, smaller projects, but this was basically to reinforce that ring around the hurricane risk reduction system around New Orleans. And there was about 350 miles of levee and flood wall that were strengthened. There was canal closures. Really, all the levee breaks happened in those 3 canals that you see under the red circles, 17th Orleans and London. And so the protection was kind of pushed out to the lake to ensure that that didn't happen again. And so there was also some pump stations and other big projects that were done in that 14.6 billion. And it's basically to build back stronger and to have a higher level, 100-year level of risk reduction for the city. And that's at a regional scale. The projects that were built really took resilience in mind. And the pictures you're seeing are of PCCP. That's a project that I worked on and led, and it was a $731 million investment. And it was a big pump stations at the lake, and it included some flood walls and storm surge gates to be able to close the drainage system and close the water from getting into the city. And then the pump stations that were added were to be able to drain basically a big part of the city once you close up for a hurricane. And the pump station itself was 24,300 CFS. And to give you an idea of what that capacity, that is a lot of water coming through. It's 3 big canals, drainage canals that drain the whole city. And that fills an Olympic-sized swimming pool in 4 seconds. So it's a lot of water. These facilities were built to make sure that Katrina didn't happen again. And they have independent power generation and fuel so that the facility could be kind of separate from the rest of the world for 5 days and operate. It has a lot of redundancy built in, and what we didn't want to have is a single point of failure. So all the electrical and mechanical systems have backups to make sure that this facility could work when it's actually needed during a hurricane. Go to the next slide. But the city has been kind of looking at alternate solutions and better ways of being resilient. And one of the ways is moving from a completely gray system to a combination of a gray and green infrastructure. I mentioned that things were being pumped out as quick as they came in. Well, green infrastructure kind of slows things down and tries to smooth out that hydrograph in the peak of the storm by providing storage on the inside of the system. One project that is about to finalize construction is Hagen Lafitte, and it includes a combination of gray system piping and reallocation of the basins plus green infrastructure to provide a complete system. And we've seen reductions of flooding up to 4 feet is what's modeled. And that includes porous pavement, rain gardens, park upgrades, basically providing pervious areas wherever the neighborhood offers opportunities. Go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the plan in action and blue-green corridors and how it relates. So that's kind of giving you a little bit of history and background. Now the city applied for Ndrc, National Disaster Resilience Competition. This is a competitive grant funding to recover from past disasters. So in order to qualify, you needed to have had a past disaster happen in your city. But the focus of the grant is to improve the ability to withstand future events, future hurricanes, and to be resilient, to come back quicker. And it really focused on the physical adaptation which are physical improvements that we can make to the system, but also on economic opportunity and on social cohesion. So it's a HUD grant, and it's not just flood reduction. It focuses on really bringing the community back and kind of focusing in on different aspects of resilience. Go to the next slide. So what the city submitted in the application was a number of projects. You can see the 9 projects there on the side for the Gentilly Resilience District, and it was creating a resilience district to kind of get to a tipping point where these set of projects really improve the quality of life for the residents there. So it focuses on drainage as the main part of it, and enough green infrastructure and drainage interventions that it really causes an effect for the whole Gentilly neighborhood. But it also provides with different amenities and different things to really improve the quality of life there. And that's really the focus of the Gentilly Resilience District. If you go to the next one, some of the goals that were provided in the application and the program, I mean, the biggest goal is to address the flooding, and also to promote infiltration and groundwater recharge, which are ways to help with the subsidence problem. So you want to try to get the water and slow it down, create storage in the system, and reintroduce it back into the aquifer. But HUD also had other goals. It wasn't just the drainage, it was public health goals, and to provide access to parks, provide recreation, amenities, health stations for people to be able to get out and exercise. Economic goals, we wanted to have this community thrive again, right? Develop economic growth, have opportunities for people that maybe left from Katrina to want to come back because it's such a great place. And then urban heat goals, also, you know, create shade and reduce heat island effect. New Orleans, it's summer like 9 months out of the year. So heat island effect is big in some of these areas that are overdeveloped. And then also cultural goals. You know, the program kind of wants to capitalize on the rich culture that New Orleans has and bring some of that culture into these parks, into these installations, and also provide some interactive educational opportunities so they can understand what's happening with their drainage or some of the other installations that are going in. If you go to the next slide. So what we did with that, once the grant was provided, it was a $141 million grant that the city received. I think they applied for 300. So we went out to the neighborhood, we went out to the community and the residents to find out, well, you know, what is it that you want? What are your needs for these projects, so that we could tailor the projects and through the planning process, provide a program that really meets their needs and addresses their concerns. And the biggest thing we heard was improved drainage. I mean, that was by far, people are tired of having to, you know, move their cars up to higher ground during rain events. And some of these are smaller, intense, you know, rainfalls of 2 or 3 inches, and just the repetitive flooding in their houses, in their finished floors. So other things that we heard were to improve the neighborhood landscaping, provide walkable and bikeable friendly areas, improve park amenities, and improve the conditions of the road. And that's an offset of the really poor soils and the subsidence that we see here in New Orleans. So we've come up with a good program with Blue Green. If you go on to the next slide, Bernadette. And I'm going to turn it over here to Bernadette. Those are kind of the goals of the grant. And now Bernadette's going to walk you through the actual project, Blue Green Corridors, and what it provides for the community.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So here's an overview of Blue Green Corridors on your screen. You can really start to see how this is a neighborhood themed project. The overall goals of the project are, number 1, to reduce neighborhood flooding. And by flooding, I'm talking about the nuisance flooding that's happening. You know, as Dan mentioned, New Orleans has perimeter controls that are really used for some of those larger hurricanes or larger storm events. But New Orleans in general, and specifically in this neighborhood in Gentilly, they're seeing flooding in even just the smallest, most regular storm events where they need to relocate their cars, as Dan mentioned. So really this project is a shift in thinking of how can we use nature-based practices to really capture the water where it falls and promote infiltration back into the ground while creating park and neighborhood amenities, providing safer routes for pedestrians and bicyclists in complete street thinking, and how to really, by doing all of this, attract economic development opportunities. So the intent really is to manage water more successfully and better, and to really maximize on the funding to provide the most amount of benefits for the community. Blue and Green Corridors is the largest of the Gentilly resiliency projects. It's a $40 million construction budget and a significant amount of roadway here. On the screen, you see Robert E. Lee Boulevard and Fillmore Avenue. Those are the east-west streets, roughly between London Avenue Canal. And as Dan mentioned, that's one of the canals that had a severe issue during Katrina, to Franklin Avenue on the east. And then Elysian Fields Avenue going in the north-south direction. That's about 3 miles of linear corridors that we have to work with. We're also looking at 2 stormwater parks at Robert E. Lee and St. Anthony Avenue, and then 4 stormwater parks at St. Roch and Robert E. Lee Boulevard. Currently, those are vacant grass lots. There's some trees on them that we'll preserve, but with those lots, we'll really be looking at ways to use strategic storage to really to work within the system. In addition to flood management, so these corridors will be used as stormwater management facilities, and I'll go into how we're doing that in a few minutes. But in addition to that, we're really looking at how can we make the most with the money that we have. So within these corridors, there's going to be improved planting. So instead of turf, we're going to put back grasses and shrubs and practices that really promote infiltration back into the ground to kind of use nature to reduce that volume of water, but also to provide a water quality benefit. We're introducing lots of trees, playgrounds, fitness areas, all with the intent of creating an amenity within a 10-minute walk with everybody within the neighborhood. So not so much just at the stormwater parks. Obviously, they'll have park amenities and recreation value as well, but we're also strategically placing these exercise playgrounds and fitness areas throughout the corridors. All of these streets will also be fitted with complete streets. Complete streets is really that concept of putting the pedestrian and the biker, prioritizing them over a vehicle. So in order to do so, we're taking bike lanes and making them protected bike lanes with bollards and high visibility striping, really looking at intersections and promoting safety through reducing crossing distances, which I'll show you in a minute. Adding pedestrian countdowns, so those are the timers that let pedestrians know when it's safe to cross the street, and high visibility painting everywhere with accessibility ramps. So really promoting walking, biking, and using these facilities as a link to the network. As Dan mentioned, Gentilly is an area within New Orleans that has seen tons of flooding over the years, and not just flooding from these large hurricanes that we've been seeing so much, really from daily storm events as well. They get over 55, 60 inches of rainfall a year. So really it's looking at how can we deal with water in this bowl-shaped community that's sinking more and more every day. This is a map showing the topography of the area. The darker green areas show the areas that are the furthest below sea level. Gentilly in general is about 8 to 10 feet below sea level and surrounded by levees and flood walls on all sides. They're also dealing with a high groundwater table, a groundwater table that's regulated by these pumping facilities. We see groundwater maybe between 4 and 6 feet below surface grade. So that really presents a challenge as well as how do we strategically collect this rainwater and get it back into the ground? The pumping system in New Orleans is very specific to this area. Again, it's that bowl-shaped community with perimeter controls around the outside. So when we get rain from a regular storm event, the issue really becomes, how do we deal with that rain? In the existing model, water is collected in catch basins or inlets on the street, routed into small pipes, and then routed into larger pipes, into underground canals, Prentice Avenue being one of them, and then eventually making its way to a pump station where it's pumped up into an above ground canal, in this case, the London Avenue Canal, and then directed north to Lake Pontchartrain. So it's really a single source stormwater management system. And this shift in thinking that we're looking at is, how can we collect water where it falls and strategically use that storage to prevent the strain on the pumping system? So how can we remove impervious cover and promote infiltration into the ground so that that water doesn't make its way into the storm network system? Again, on the right side of the screen is an approximate area of the project area, where we're really looking at finding strategic ways to pull that water out of the system during the peak of the storm event. And as Dan mentioned with that hydrograph, really the peak is what we're trying to manage here, because that's what is resulting in this nuisance flooding that we see so often. So if we can even just create these storage or these strategic storage areas that temporarily hold the water, there's a lot of value in that, so that they can be released back into the storm system after the peak of the storm has passed. So we've talked about blue and green corridors as the project name, but I want to talk through what this really means. Blue corridor is really a new concept. It's that idea of a permanent pool of water that's used for flood management. So in the top there, the existing condition really shows clearly why we have an issue here. In most cases in New Orleans, there's streets that are divided by medians or neutral grounds that are grassed areas that are mounded, that push the water back toward the edge of the street where it's collected in inlets and catch basins and then routed to those pump stations. Unfortunately, the neutral grounds don't really provide much benefit for us here. They are pervious, which is good, and that promotes little infiltration back into the ground. But really, they're not used in any way for flood management. In our proposed design, what we're planning to do is shift the water from the inlets back into the median, so excavate 10, 12 feet below the existing grade to really create a permanent pool of water, so a depth of maybe 4 to 6 feet, and then to provide a little bit of freeboard on top of that, another 4 feet or so, to handle those flood waters. Now, the interesting thing here is that it's not just a drainage ditch. It's really something that we're trying to create an amenity out of it to really tie down on those triple bottom line benefits that Dan mentioned. So flood management, but also looking at the social value of adding a waterway into an area that, you know, New Orleans is interesting because they're surrounded by water on all sides, and the city has its identity built on water. But once you're inside these neighborhoods, you realize you're surrounded by concrete levees and flood walls all over the place. There really isn't that feel or that sense of water. So this is really an innovative and creative way to invite water back into the community. In these canal systems, or linear wetlands as we're calling them, the water is circulated through pumps. So there's air bubble filters, similar to what you would see in a fish tank that provides water to the system. We also have pumps to circulate the water and fountains for more amenity. So this is what a blue corridor would look like. On the left, you can see the existing condition where really the water falls on the medians and then runs off into the roadway and is collected on the edge of the roadway in those inlets. And on the right side is showing a flooded condition of the blue corridor. You see two sections there. The main is a little bit deeper, and that'll be our linear wetland system. And then on the left side of that proposed image, you can see what we're calling a backflow marsh area. Those areas are slightly higher in elevation and they would have less water. And the intent with those is really that we'd be using them as flushing out the water and providing additional water quality benefits. So as the water is circulated within the system, it'll be brought to the top of a backflow marsh area and then flow back into the main channel. We have several of these throughout the corridor. Green corridors are corridors that we're retrofitting with green infrastructure technology. In these cases, they weren't able to be blue corridors based on the width of the existing neutral ground or based on existing utility conflicts that prevented us from digging down quite as deep as we did on Elysian Fields. Again, on the existing condition, what you see is the neutral ground is slightly elevated and is pushing water back to the edge of the roadway where it's collected and sent to the pump station. On these streets, what we're looking to do is expand the pervious area to the greatest extent. So part of these streets, were originally 2 lanes, and through our traffic analysis, we were able to see that they didn't need to be 2 lanes everywhere. The roadway widths were actually quite wide and didn't need to be that wide. So we took advantage of some of those areas to create road diets or to reduce the width of the roadway to make room for that additional green space that we were seeking. Now, green infrastructure practices are practices that really thrive on the concept of capturing rainwater and managing it where it falls to keep it out of the stormwater management system. And this is particularly important in these smaller storm events where we're really seeing flood issues in the neighborhood. Green infrastructure is perfect for this because they're designed for that smaller storm event. And really the intent is to promote infiltration back into the ground. You create these temporary storage areas that are able to temporarily hold the water enough so it has time to filter through the soil back into the groundwater. And what you see here is that, while they create slight little depressions that are able to hold the water, and in normal condition, they would be dry. So these are the 2 types of green infrastructure practices that we're using on this project. Median bioswales will be used within the median or neutral grounds. And again, these are temporary storage areas that'll be planted with really high quality native plants, trees, and a very, very absorbent soil. So it's about 18 inches or so of an engineered soil media. Again, these systems are all going to be relatively shallow in the vertical direction because of the groundwater condition that we have. So the intent really is that they'll be flatter and wider systems than a typical green infrastructure installation. On the right side, you see a stormwater bump out. A stormwater bump out is essentially a curb extension where we take the curb and project it into the street, typically within a shoulder or a parking lane. And this can be done at the intersections, as we have shown here, but also mid-block is quite common as well. For this project, we have bump outs at every single intersection. And not only does this provide stormwater benefits, it's capturing the water as it comes down the street prior to coming into an existing inlet structure. And again, promoting infiltration back into the ground, providing a site amenity, and providing water quality and air quality benefits. But it's also being used as a transportation improvement project to really bump out and reduce that pedestrian crossing distance as it crosses the street. So that makes the cars slow down because the road actually narrows in those locations, and it also makes the pedestrian feel safer because the distance is shorter for them to cross the street. We're also looking at parks with co-benefits. So these are the 6 lots that I mentioned earlier at St. Roch and St. Anthony. And Robert E. Lee Boulevard. These are vacant parcels that have been taken over by the city over the years. And the intent really is to look at this with a triple bottom line approach of how can we address flooding, but how can we also look at adding site amenities to really build that social and environmental awareness and cohesion in the neighborhood that we're looking for. These parks will have a mixture of open storage. So the 2 parks will have water features with a permanent pool of water. And the other 2 sides on the other parks will have more of green infrastructure or temporary storage that can be flexible space. So it provides a slight depression in the ground that can be used to capture and filter stormwater runoff. But during a dry event, they could also be used as seating areas, recreational space. So it's really making the best use of the space that we have and trying to create the most benefit for the community. We're also very focused on creating amenities throughout the corridor. So we've done a lot of programming studies of how can these corridors become links to existing destinations. In doing so, we're wondering how can we make these roads feel safer? How can we provide better walkways, safer bike lanes so that everybody feels comfortable using these to get to existing destinations. We also looked at how can these corridors become destinations in themselves. And by doing so, we looked at 10-minute walking distances from everybody, as you can see on the map here, and really tried to put features along the corridor so that there was something for everybody. So not only do we have the 6 parks on the perimeter of Robert E. Lee, We have bicycle stations, fitness equipment, parks, and other recreational benefits, step down areas for the wetland systems within Elysian Fields Avenue, Robert E. Lee, and Fillmore. And we've also studied how these could be used as recreational loops and exercise loops. So we'll have signage kind of saying where a good running loop might be, where a good exercise equipment loop might be. So we've really thought through a lot of the programming on a much higher scale. And finally, complete streets. So again, that's that idea of putting the pedestrian and the bicyclist first. In the existing condition, there's not very much striping on the streets. A lot of the bike lanes are called sharrows, where the biker rides on the street with the car. And the intent is really that the car moves around the biker. The result of that really is that the biker doesn't feel safe and doesn't have their own dedicated space. So in a complete streets idea, as you can see on the right side, there's a lot of striping, there's a lot of dedication of space for individuals to cross the street. There's accessible curb ramps at every single intersection, the stormwater bump outs, which again reduce that pedestrian crossing distance. And you can see we're implementing bike lanes on every single street in this project with bollards and striping, really to make them feel like they have their own dedicated space and to provide that aspect of safety and encourage everybody to use this space without a vehicle. There's 3 phases of this project. Phase 1 is Robert E. Lee, which is that east-west street on the north side, and Elysian Fields Avenue, which is the main street. That's phase 1. Phase 2 is Fillmore Avenue, which is the east-west street on the south side of the project. And then phase 3 will be the 6 lots. The intent really was to debundle these packages so that we could get everything moving and construction moving sequentially on all 3 projects. And all work is meant to be completed by fall of 2022. So pretty exciting. So with the HUD funding, there's a lot of documentation that needs to happen in terms of defining the benefits and ensuring that the investment is a sound investment. As I've mentioned a few times, we've done a triple bottom line benefit cost analysis. So that's really a mouthful, but what it means is we're looking at what are the benefits of the project when you look at that base case, what the existing conditions would be, and then we compare it with this design alternatives that we've come up with. Looking at the life cycle cost of the project, so not only looking at the cost to implement these practices, but what does that cost to maintain and operate them into the future? It also looks at the avoided costs. So what are the avoided costs associated with flood damage reduction and subsidence? And finally, what are the social and environmental benefits or disbenefits? In this case, it's all benefits because we're creating lots of parks and features that are really promoting nature first. So a BCA, a benefit cost analysis, looks at the present value of benefits over the present value of costs. And a BCA generates a ratio. A ratio of over 1 means that the project's worthwhile. Now, the interesting thing with HUD funding is that it really does look at this triple bottom line approach, whereas other funding typically only looks at flood damage reduction. With that said, flood damage reduction is the biggest benefit of this project. The avoided costs are about $4 billion over the next 50 years for looking at projects that implement these types of controls. The interventions that we're doing, again, are reducing the impervious cover, so implementing the stormwater bump outs, the road diets, increasing the pervious area through increasing the size of the medians, and really looking at ways to strategically store this rainwater to reduce the peak of the storm event. Now, the results are pretty relevant. Flood risk reduction, improved safety, improved confidence in the neighborhood. So as Dan mentioned, everybody moves their cars when they know a storm's coming. The ability to keep your car there really drives confidence in the market to bring investment back into the neighborhood. And with all of that comes improved water quality, air quality, and habitat, again, because we're adding so much vegetation and removing that impervious cover. As part of our project, we looked at modeling what the existing conditions were and the design alternatives. This is a dot map showing the storm reduction in a 10-year storm event with the project area highlighted in red. As you can see, the depth of flood reduction varies throughout the watershed, but up to 6 inches. And while 6 inches might not seem like a lot, 1 inch per FEMA, 1 inch of flooding in one home can cause up to $25,000 of damage. If you just think about stepping into your car, that's only a few inches off of the ground. So it's really the difference between saving your car. It could be a step up to your house, so water getting into your house. So 6 inches is very, very significant. Now, the interesting thing about this project is when we modeled it, we found that there were benefits beyond our project, which was really great to see. And that's due to the interconnected nature of some of these watersheds and the way the pumping systems work. So in this case, we're seeing about 2.5 inches of flood reduction in an adjacent neighborhood. So it really drives down that point of, as you implement these projects throughout the city and use this as a model for future development, there's incremental benefits that happen even outside of the project area. We're also improving water quality. As water quality comes with, there's a concentration and a volume of water that we're trying to deal with. We're reducing the volume by strategically storing it in these practices that are able to infiltrate it into the ground, really giving it a chance to use nature as the best water quality filter. And by filtering it through these soil practices, we're really reducing the sediment, mineral, and contaminant from the stormwater runoff that we're getting from the roadways that we don't want in our stormwater system. We're using nature to filter it through that high quality soil before it's being infiltrated back into the ground, or in some cases put back into the stormwater management system. Subsidence reduction is a very, very big factor on this project as well. As Dan mentioned, this project is overlaid delta soils, which really have that ability like a sponge. When they're wet, they retain their shape, but as the sponge dries out, as those soils dry out, you get a lot of settling and cracking. So not only do they see roadway cracking, they're settling where residents have to pour sand underneath their foundations. These are all slab on grade without basements. And it's pretty common that residents have to put sand underneath of their foundations to prevent their house from settling. Not only that, all of the utility cracks that you see and upgrades that need to happen as a result of this uneven settlement that's happening. The city has estimated that there's about $2 billion over the next 50 years as a result of subsidence in this neighborhood. So really looking at systems that promote infiltration and keep those soils wet are how we're able to reduce subsidence. The results really are looking at the avoided cost of reducing the roadway or repaving the roadway and repairing those stormwater lines. So really it's looking at increasing the operation and maintenance and how the timing between when those roadways have to be replaced. Again, we're looking at water quality, air quality, and habitat benefits as well, all by promoting infiltration and installing these green infrastructure practices. And finally, improved quality of life. I think it's been a really fun time working on this project and really taking a really hard look at what can we do to maximize the benefits. This is a great picture at the top of Elysian Fields linear wetland where we've implemented parks, lots of green space areas for them to step down and look at the water to really build that social and environmental awareness and create environmental stewards for the future. Again, these practices are all located within walking distance, so there's an amazing park within every corridor of these projects, which makes it really great for the community. So wrapping up with the benefit cost analysis, I mentioned how that really looks at the present value of benefits over the present value of cost. You can see on the right side of the screen how that's all come to play. We've used a program called AutoCase in addition to some of our internal modeling for the flood and subsidence to develop this benefit cost analysis. And our results show that the BCA ratio is 1.67, which is amazing. That means for every dollar spent, there's $1.67 in benefits. So really this project is well beyond worthwhile to do. The greatest benefits that we saw, again, were from flood damage reduction, subsidence reduction, and improved quality of life. And the greatest cost, which were, not surprising are the capital costs to install the project, the operation and maintenance costs to maintain the project, and then the replacement cost as these assets become older and need to be repaired or replaced. Okay, then I'll pass it back to Dan.
Thank you, Bernadette. And just to talk a little bit more about those benefits too. I mean, there's some health benefits in there as well that we calculated based on the additional physical activity that people could get in these bike lanes and these walking areas, exercise stations and park. It's really focused on getting people outdoors, providing enough shade in some of these walkways to allow them to enjoy this a larger time of the year, and reducing that heat island effect that kind of heats up these neighborhoods and makes them, sometimes so hot that it's unbearable. So that this tries to provide that shade to make it more usable. But in conclusion, I mean, Bernadette did a great job to describe all the components of the blue-green corridors. But like that, those type of solutions have to be part of any drainage plan, any project that cities, wherever they are, kind of, when they have these challenges of stormwater and other social and environmental challenges, must be incorporated into these projects. These kind of newer technologies or ways of thinking can be adapted to any community, and we've done projects all over the U.S. In different soils and different drainage conditions, with different water quality needs, heat and different community needs. So you really just have to customize the approach to your specific needs and what that project is. And each site is going to present, unique opportunities. Like we had these medians that were underutilized, and we kind of took that opportunity. And the other project that I mentioned, Hagen Lafitte, there was a park that we were able to utilize some underground drainage. But even if you're in a tight area, you can do some tree wells, you can do some pervious pavement. So there's always an opportunity to do this, and it does come at an increased cost, but it does help to increase the resilience of the community and of your drainage system. So if you have any questions of how to kind of implement one of these green infrastructure or blue infrastructure solutions, I think Bernadette has the contact information there for her and me. You can ask us any questions you want, or kind of lean on some of the experiences that we've had in New Orleans and in other areas in the country. So with that, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them.
Great, thanks Bernadette, thanks Dan. Because we are running a little late, I'm going to go ahead and just unmute everyone. And that way, if there's any comments or questions that people would like to ask live, we can do that. Anyone that's asked a question through the questions box, we will follow up with you directly and take care of it there. That way we get a little chance for some discussion here at the end without taking too much time here. And if nobody wants to ask anything live because they're nervous or whatever, I can ask some of the questions that.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
This is Mike Griffith in Denver. I was just curious, in the scale of all the green infrastructure projects that you've engaged with, Dan and Bernadette, is this the largest in terms of sort of linear project size?
I think this is the largest green infrastructure project that I've had in such a small consolidated neighborhood. Green infrastructure is typically installed in other cities, in neighborhoods and blocks. But this is, as Dan mentioned on that first slide with the 9 different practices or programs that are happening in this specific neighborhood, there is overlap in some of the projects. St. Anthony is another project that we're working on as a sub to Batcher, and that intersects our streets going north and south. So it is really interesting how big of a scale this project is, in particular in this neighborhood.
Yeah, and I think this is the biggest singular project that I've seen that has green infrastructure. There's bigger programs in different places. I think Bernadette's worked in Philadelphia, and they have a pretty robust program, and Chicago and other places. But I think with green infrastructure, it's not a one project, meets the demand. It's kind of getting to that tipping point where you have enough installations throughout the entire basin that you're able to kind of affect the drainage basin overall. And that includes, maybe having some installations in areas that aren't the low areas. Even if you intercept some of the water in the higher areas that maybe don't see flooding, that can have an effect on your overall drainage system and what eventually gets down to the low spots. So it's kind of getting enough singular projects throughout an area to really make a difference.
And thank you for that. And just as a follow-up, how does this compare to sort of our peers in the industry for a green infrastructure project? I mean, to me, it strikes me as a very large GI project in an urban area. And I can't think of really any other company that's doing a project at this scale. So I just thought it might be interesting to hear your take on that. How are our competitors dealing with projects of this size, or are they?
So Bernadette, do you want to talk from the Philadelphia perspective? I don't know of any other really large projects. I can think of Miami-Dade County. They have a few parks where they're large parks that they've done some green infrastructure. I know we're also working on the Baton Rouge Green Infrastructure Program, and that is a roadway program, the Move BR program. So that's a pretty large scale program where they're incorporating for the first time green infrastructure into their roadway reconstruction. So I would think that would be a similar scale. Bernadette?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I think the drivers for green infrastructure really varies depending on where you are. In Philadelphia, for example, or New York City, the driver for green infrastructure really is a combined sewer overflow system. So taking a step back, green infrastructure is really that concept of managing the first flush, of looking at these smaller, more frequent storm events and getting them out of the system. So there are programs that are tied to consent decrees for combined sewer overflows, and those are pretty significant, again, in Philly and in New York City. Other programs that I can think of are more tied to a water quality component, so like an MS4 consent decree, looking at water quality, total suspended solids, nitrates and phosphorus removal. And those are more scattered throughout the country. And then, of course, in this case, we're using it as both a water quality and a water quantity. Again, I think this is the biggest singular project, but certainly many areas of the country are looking at this on a programmatic scale.
Bernadette, and wasn't there, he mentioned competitors or other firms that are doing stuff. I think there was SPV. Was that the name of the company that I think was in Denver, Colorado, that is part of our team that had a pretty large similar project? I mean, it wasn't to this scale, but it did include some blue infrastructure and some green infrastructure. I can get you that information of that project, since you're in Denver too, so you might be able to go see it.
Thank you. Very exciting project. It's great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alaska. A couple quick ones here. What's the infiltration rate of the engineered media you're using in the bioswales?
So we're calling for a very sand content mix. I would guess it's in like the 1 to 2 inches per hour range. The idea really is that we're going to be using new soil or amending the existing soil to give the water a chance to really filter through that. So it's a sandy mix with some organics mixed into it.
And there is some drainage rock that's also part of the installation as well, which has a little bit more storage capacity to it under some of that filtration media. And one thing to consider is that, New Orleans is not the ideal place for green infrastructure, right? There's really bad clay soils that don't allow for a lot of infiltration. So, a lot of what we're doing is reintroducing some water into those dry soils, but we're not counting on a lot of infiltration to handle peak storm events. For that we're kind of going more on the blue and green infrastructure storage that we are providing, not so much kind of going back into the aquifer. There is some of that, but it's limited. There's other areas where that's how they get all their drainage. It's going back into the aquifer. So, that might be a different type of installation there.
All right, we'll do one final question here. Is the timeline for the project on track, and are there any impediments that you expect to face as it moves forward?
Yeah, we're moving on track. We're pretty excited to get construction going early next year.
Yeah, there's always challenges with schedules and things that come up, but the team has kind of reacted really well to try to resolve some of these, and so far, we are still on schedule, and there is a schedule deadline from the funding, which is the end of 2022. Is that right? Around there, September, somewhere around there. So we are meeting that, and we are kind of ahead of the program right now with other projects, and hopefully we'll get into construction here really soon at the beginning of next year.
Yeah, and that was another reason why the project was broken down into 3 separate phases. So potentially it could be bid out to 3 separate contractors that can be working at the same time to really meet that time goal that we have.
There's one more that just came in that I think is a good way to end, and that's, how has the community reacted to this effort and to this project?
That's a good question. We've had a lot of community engagement starting back in the end of 2018. As Dan mentioned, going to festivals, having visioning forums, meeting with community leaders, door to door. And more recently, with COVID, we've had to really adopt a different strategy of Zoom calls, webinars. We've installed large scale renderings out in the field now. So as you're driving by, you can kind of see some of those renderings that we've presented today of what's happening here. Targeted mailers and coloring books going out to residents. In general, I think initially there was a little bit of pushback of, do we really want this water feature in our neighborhood and so close to our homes? And a lot of it was education as well, of ensuring the community that it wasn't going to be stagnant water that promoted insects and mosquitoes in their neighborhood, and really that we had thought through all of those challenges of keeping the water moving and creating a safe place for them. I would say the community is really excited to see all of the other amenities in addition to the flood management.
Yeah, and I think we've gotten all the gamut of reactions to it. In general, it has been really positive because this is probably an underserved area that there hasn't been a lot of investment into amenities and fixing the roads and drainage. So they're definitely welcoming of the investment. Like any project, you can't please everybody. And you do have sometimes people that don't like change in their community, don't want to deal with the construction of it, feel that, the facilities once built, they're not going to be maintained. So we've done our best to kind of adjust our design to the community concerns and really address some of their concerns with the city and with, the design itself, to try to make it as maintenance free as possible, make sure that there's not going to be issues with mosquitoes, things like that. So we definitely have been very responsive to them. And I think the community is very happy to see the project move forward.
Yeah, and plus the community had a lot of input on some of the design. So in the beginning, we had a lot of visioning boards of kind of what would you like to see with this space in terms of programming. So the community has had a lot of input, and we've listened and implemented a lot of those types of programs because we want them to use it. We want them to take ownership of this.
Great. Well, we're 5 minutes over, so let's wrap it up there. If you have follow-up questions, everyone, please just reach out to Dan and Bernadette. Thank you for attending, and thanks to Dan and Bernadette for the presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank
I
you.
hope everyone
Thank
has a
you.
great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.